In a kingdom where the crown was heavy, but the gossip was heavier, one woman ruled not with a sword, but with a smirk, a fan, and a dangerously well-timed wink. She wasn't queen, she wasn't noble, she was Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, the royal mistress who controlled the throne, while everyone else was too busy sipping tea and misplacing their wigs. So fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and prepare for a bedtime story so boringly brilliant, it might just lull you into dreams of powdered wigs and passive-aggressive embroidery. And hey, if you enjoy sleepy scandals and historical hilarity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're tuning in from London, Lisbon, or the lost kingdom of Snorlandia. We're glad you're here in the quaint and questionably relevant village of Drowsington upon Yon, where the most thrilling event was the annual Snail Parade. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore was born under a cloud of mild indifference and a particularly sleepy moon. Her birth was marked by a single hiccup from the town Mayor and a yawn from the midwife, who promptly fell asleep in the hay. Mildred's early years were defined by a series of almost events. She nearly won the village's most decorative teacup contest. Her entry was disqualified for being too symmetrical, and she once invented a new form of embroidery that looked suspiciously like spilled soup. Her parents, Lord Tiberius Snore and Lady Petunia Pompington, were known for their ability to host dinner parties where absolutely nothing happened. At age 17, Mildred was sent to the royal court, not because she was ambitious, but because her aunt mistook the palace for a bakery and dropped her off by accident. There, she was assigned as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Petunia, the perpetually confused, a monarch who believed her crown was a fruit bowl and regularly addressed her footstool as Sir Reginald. Mildred quickly rose through the ranks of court society, not by scheming, but by mastering the art of strategic nodding. She could nod in agreement, nod in confusion, and even nod in a way that made people question their own decisions. Her greatest achievement was once nodding so convincingly during a royal debate on cabbage tariffs that the entire council voted to outlaw vegetables. It was during one of these debates, while the king was distracted by a particularly shiny spoon, that Mildred caught the eye of King Barnaby, the easily distracted. Barnaby was a man of simple pleasures: jam, jousting, and staring at reflective surfaces. He was immediately enchanted by Mildred's brooch, which resembled a spoon and sparkled just enough to hold his attention for a full 7 seconds. A personal record. Thus began the most boringly scandalous affair in royal history. Mildred didn't seduce the king with passion or poetry. She simply offered him a biscuit and asked if he'd ever considered reorganizing the throne room furniture. Within weeks, she was advising him on matters of state, fashion, and which curtains best matched his mood swings. The court was baffled. The nobles whispered. The queen's parrot began quoting Mildred's advice, and somewhere, deep in the royal archives, a historian began scribbling notes for a chapter titled King Barnaby, the Easily Distracted, had many passions: jam, jousting, and staring at shiny things, but none compared to his newfound obsession, the spoon-shaped brooch worn by Lady Mildred Pompington Snore. It wasn't just any brooch. It was a modest silver spoon, slightly bent, with a tiny sapphire embedded in the handle. Mildred had found it in a drawer labeled Miscellaneous Royal Trinkets and Expired Coupons, and pinned it to her gown purely out of boredom. She had no idea it would change the course of history. The moment Barnaby saw it, he gasped. "Is that a spoon?" he whispered, eyes wide with wonder. "A spoon with ambition." From that day forward, the king insisted on seeing the brooch daily. He summoned Mildred to court meetings, royal breakfasts, and even his weekly nap reviews, just to admire the spoon. Ministers grew concerned. The kingdom's treasury was in chaos, the border disputes unresolved, and yet the king spent hours sketching spoon designs on parchment and muttering, "It's elegant, yet practical." Mildred, ever the master of passive influence, began using the spoon as a tool of power. She would tilt it slightly when she disagreed with a policy. She would polish it when she wanted attention. She once used it to reflect sunlight directly into the eyes of the Duke of Crumblebottom during a debate, causing him to vote in favor of royal nap subsidies. Soon, nobles began wearing spoon-themed accessories to gain favor. The Earl of Buttershire wore spoon cufflinks. The Countess of Tiddlewink commissioned a spoon tiara. The Queen, confused as ever, wore an actual soup ladle on her head and declared herself mistress of utensils. Behind the scenes, Mildred was quietly reshaping the kingdom. She advised the king on trade deals, more jam, fewer taxes, military strategy, send soldiers with biscuits, and palace renovations, add more cushions, all while sipping tea and occasionally sighing in a way that made generals question their life choices. The spoon became a symbol of power, and Mildred, its wielder, became the most influential figure in the realm, without ever raising her voice or lifting a sword. And so, in the sleepy halls of Snorlandia, where decisions were made between yawns and jam tastings, Lady Mildred began her quiet reign, one spoonful at a time. The palace of Snorlandia was a place of grandeur, gossip, and garments so frilly they could double as small tents. Every morning, the royal court gathered for tea, a ritual so sacred that even the guards wore lace gloves, and the biscuits had titles. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had mastered the art of tea diplomacy. She knew exactly how long to stir her cup to signal disapproval, how to raise an eyebrow while sipping to suggest intrigue, and how to drop a sugar cube with just enough flair to make the Duke of Buttershire question his inheritance. But beneath the clinking of porcelain and the rustle of taffeta, treachery brewed. The Countess of Crinkleton, a woman whose gowns were so wide she had to enter rooms sideways, had grown suspicious of Mildred's influence. "She's too calm," the Countess whispered to her pet hedgehog, Sir Prickles. "Too composed, too spoon-adjacent." Determined to uncover Mildred's secrets, the Countess launched a covert operation known as Project Petticoat. It involved hiding behind curtains, bribing footmen with jam, and once disguising herself as a particularly judgmental fern. Unfortunately, she was thwarted at every turn, mostly because Mildred E.S. daily routine was so boring it caused spies to fall asleep mid-scroll. Meanwhile, Mildred continued her quiet ascent. She advised the king on trade, more biscuits, fewer boats, fashion, less velvet, more nap-friendly fabrics, and diplomacy, send muffins, not messengers. Her influence was so subtle that even the royal advisors began quoting her without realizing it. One afternoon, during a particularly dramatic tea spill, the Queen stood up and declared, "I hereby appoint Lady Mildred as royal advisor of teacup affairs." No one knew what that meant, but it sounded official. and Mildred received a sash made entirely of napkins. The Countess, enraged, attempted to expose Mildred by presenting a scroll titled Reasons Why Mildred is Probably a Sorceress. It included such damning evidence as she once blinked twice during a thunderstorm. Her spoon brooch sparkled suspiciously. She knew the difference between chamomile and lavender. The scroll was promptly eaten by the Queen's parrot, who squawked Mildred for Prime Minister and flew into a chandelier. And so, the court continued sipping, scheming, and sash adjusting, unaware that the true power in the palace wore slippers, sighed strategically, and ruled with a spoon. Once a fortnight, the kingdom of Snorlandia held its most sacred and sleep-inducing event, the Royal Yawn Council. It was a gathering of the realm's most powerful and drowsiest minds, assembled to discuss matters of state while sipping lukewarm tea and pretending to stay awake. The council chamber was a grand hall lined with velvet cushions, fainting couches, and portraits of ancestors who looked mildly disappointed. Each noble was issued a blanket, a biscuit, and a bell to ring in case they accidentally fell asleep mid-debate. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, now unofficially in charge of everything that actually mattered, sat beside King Barnaby, who was busy trying to balance a biscuit on his nose. Mildred had mastered the art of council navigation. She spoke only in soothing tones, used words like perhaps, muffin, and strategic napping, and occasionally sighed in a way that made the treasurer rethink the national budget. The agenda for the day included whether the royal pigeons should wear hats, a proposal to rename the kingdom Napshire, the alarming rise in jam theft among nobles, the Duke of Buttershire, who had recently mistaken a curtain for a diplomat, stood to speak. I propose we invest in more cushions. The current ones lack emotional support. The Earl of Tiddlewink, who had been asleep since last Tuesday, mumbled something about blanket tariffs and was applauded for his insight. Mildred, ever the tactician, leaned forward and gently tapped her spoon brooch. The room fell silent. Might I suggest, she said, that we redirect funds from the royal hat budget to the Ministry of Muffins? A well-fed kingdom is a peaceful kingdom. The motion passed unanimously. The Queen, who had been conversing with her footstool, Sir Reginald, declared it the most productive nap I've ever attended. By the end of the session, 3 nobles had snored through a vote. One had proposed a treaty with the moon, and Mildred had quietly rewritten the kingdom's trade policy using biscuit crumbs and a napkin. And so, the Royal Yawn Council adjourned with a collective sigh, a few polite snores, and a new national motto: peace, pastries, and polite indifference. In the palace of Snorlandia, wigs weren't just fashion. They were status, storage, and occasionally wildlife habitat. Nobles wore wigs so large they required scaffolding. The Queen's ceremonial wig had its own postal code, and the Duke of Crumblebottom once hosted a dinner party inside his. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, ever the quiet observer, had long suspected that beneath the powdered curls and decorative feathers lay more than just scalp. She was right. It began with a whisper, literally. One morning, while passing the Earl of Tiddlewink in the corridor, Mildred heard his wig mutter, "The muffins are in position." She paused, blinked twice, and moved on. She'd learned not to question anything before tea. Later that week, during a royal luncheon themed vegetables that look like nobles, Mildred noticed the Chancellor, adjusting his wig and pulling out a scroll. Not from his pocket, from the wig itself. It was labeled Top Secret Muffin Protocol. Intrigued, Mildred launched her own investigation. She began complimenting wigs with suspicious enthusiasm. What a voluminous masterpiece, Lady Crinkleton. Is that a secret treaty tucked behind the ostrich feather? The lady blushed and quickly changed the subject to embroidery tariffs. Soon, Mildred discovered that wigs were being used to smuggle jam across borders, hide royal decrees from nosy parrots, store emergency biscuits for long council meetings. The Queen's wig, it turned out, contained a miniature tea set, 3 backup crowns, a tiny portrait of Sir Reginald the Footstool. Mildred, ever resourceful, began using her own modest wig to store strategic items: a spoon-shaped compass, a map of the palace drawn in biscuit crumbs, and a tiny fan she used to signal the kitchen staff during boring banquets. One evening, during the annual Wig Ball, where nobles danced while balancing fruit arrangements on their heads, Mildred made her move. She casually dropped a note from her wig into the king's goblet. It read, "If you wish to rule wisely, start with your wig." The king, who had recently begun wearing a wig shaped like a swan, took the message to heart. He declared a new royal initiative, wig transparency. All nobles were required to declare the contents of their wigs monthly. The Duke of Buttershire fainted. The Countess of Crinkleton claimed diplomatic immunity. The Queen's wig was declared a national monument. And Mildred? She simply smiled, adjusted her curls, and added a tiny scroll labeled Phase 2 to her collection. It began, as most royal scandals do, with a pair of velvet slippers. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had long favored comfort over couture, while other nobles clomped through the palace in shoes that resembled miniature carriages. Mildred glided silently in soft, plum-colored slippers, embroidered with tiny spoons. They were cozy, quiet, and, according to the Countess of Crinkleton, a threat to national dignity. The Countess, whose own footwear required a footman and a pulley system, declared the slippers an affront to tradition. She claimed they undermined the seriousness of court proceedings and made her feel emotionally underdressed. The Queen, confused as ever, asked if slippers were a type of bird. The scandal escalated when Mildred wore the slippers to a diplomatic banquet honoring the visiting Duke of Snoozylvania. The Duke, impressed by her footwear, requested a pair for himself and promptly signed a treaty agreeing to share his kingdom's jam reserves. The nobles were stunned. The slippers had achieved what years of negotiations could not. Whispers spread through the palace. She's weaponizing comfort. Those slippers are enchanted. I heard they contain tiny scrolls of influence. The Royal Shoe Guild, a group of nobles who met weekly to discuss heel height and toe point etiquette, demanded an inquiry. Mildred was summoned to defend her choice of footwear before the Council of Ornamental Fashion and Passive Aggression. She arrived wearing the slippers. The council gasped. One member fainted into a pile of decorative tassels. The Duke of Buttershire attempted to confiscate the slippers, but was distracted by a passing tray of muffins. Mildred, ever composed, simply said, "A ruler must walk softly, lest she wake the kingdom." The room fell silent. The Queen clapped. The parrot squawked, "Slippers for all," and flew into a chandelier. By the end of the week, half the court had adopted velvet slippers. The Royal Shoe Guild disbanded in protest. The Countess of Crinkleton began wearing padded boots and muttering about the decline of civilization. And Mildred? She added a second pair to her collection, this one embroidered with tiny crowns. Thus, the scandal of the velvet slippers ended not with outrage, but with a nap. A very comfortable, well-accessorized nap. It was a truth universally acknowledged in Snorlandia that no one made decisions after sunset without a muffin. The royal kitchen, staffed by sleep-deprived bakers and one suspiciously philosophical raccoon, produced over 300 muffins a day, each one catalogued, ranked, and occasionally knighted. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, ever the quiet strategist, had discovered that muffins were more than snacks. They were leverage. It began one moonlit evening when Mildred, unable to sleep due to the Queen's parrot reciting tax codes, wandered into the kitchen and found a tray of untouched blueberry muffins. She took one, sighed thoughtfully, and had an idea so sleepy, yet brilliant, it would change the course of Snorlandian diplomacy. She called it the Midnight Muffin Strategy. The plan was simple. Deliver muffins to key nobles during their most vulnerable hour, between yawns and bedtime. Attach tiny notes inside the muffin wrappers with suggestions like, perhaps we reconsider the jam embargo, or wouldn't a nap-based economy be more sustainable? Observe how quickly policies changed after a well-timed snack. The results were astonishing. The Duke of Buttershire, after receiving a warm banana muffin, reversed his stance on curtain taxes. The Chancellor, gifted a lemon poppy seed muffin, approved funding for the Royal Nap Pavilion. Even the Queen, handed a muffin shaped like a crown, declared, I hereby appoint Mildred as Muffin Minister, before falling asleep in her soup. Mildred's influence grew. Nobles began requesting muffins before meetings. Debates were paused for muffin mediation. One ambassador refused to sign a treaty until he'd tasted the elusive triple chocolate truce muffin. Of course, not everyone was pleased. The Countess of Crinkleton accused Mildred of culinary manipulation. She attempted to counter the muffin strategy with her own initiative. The Scone Rebellion, it failed spectacularly when her scones were declared too aggressive, and one exploded during a council session. Meanwhile, Mildred kept her muffin empire running smoothly. She trained a team of discreet muffin messengers, mostly retired footmen, and one unusually stealthy goose. She developed muffin codes: blueberry, peace proposal, bran, budget adjustment, chocolate chip, please stop jousting indoors. By the end of the month, Snorlandia was more peaceful, more padded, and slightly more crumb-covered than ever before. And Mildred? She simply smiled, adjusted her slippers, and added a new title to her growing list: Lady Mildred, Mistress of Muffins, and Midnight Influence. In most kingdoms, parrots are pets. In Snorlandia, they're cabinet members. The Queen's parrot, Sir Squawkington, was no ordinary bird. He wore a tiny velvet cape, had his own chambermaid, and once received a knighthood for his services to royal distraction. His official title was Avian Advisor of Ambiguous Affairs, and his job was to repeat things he overheard, whether they were useful, scandalous, or completely unrelated to reality. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had long suspected that Sir Squawkington was more than just a feathered nuisance. He had a habit of quoting her private conversations, often with dramatic flair. Mildred says muffins are mightier than swords. The Duke of Buttershire smells like regret and lavender, down with curtain taxes. The Queen, who believed Sir Squawkington was fluent in ancient diplomacy, took his squawks as divine guidance. She once declared war on a neighboring kingdom because the parrot shouted, "Feathers before borders," during breakfast. Mildred, ever strategic, began using the parrot to her advantage. She'd casually mention ideas near his perch. "Wouldn't it be lovely if the palace had more cushions? I hear the Chancellor naps too aggressively. Jam tariffs are so last century." Within days, these ideas echoed through the halls, squawked by Sir Squawkington with increasing authority. Nobles began quoting him in council meetings. The Earl of Tiddlewink proposed a bill based entirely on the parrot's ramblings. The Queen nodded solemnly and declared, "If the bird says so, it must be true." But not everyone was amused. The Countess of Crinkleton accused Mildred of avian manipulation. She attempted to train her own parrot, Lady Beakerton, but the bird only repeated the phrase, "Where are my socks?" and bit the Chancellor. Meanwhile, Sir Squawkington's fame grew. He was invited to diplomatic banquets, given his own muffin ration, and once asked to bless a royal wedding. Mildred, quietly amused, gifted him a tiny spoon-shaped brooch. The parrot wore it proudly and squawked, "Mildred for Queen," every time someone sneezed. And so, in a palace ruled by size, slippers, and spoon symbolism, a confused parrot became the loudest voice in politics. Mildred simply smiled, adjusted her wig, and whispered to the bird. In most kingdoms, naps are personal. In Snorlandia, they became constitutional law. It all began when Lady Mildred Pompington Snore noticed a troubling trend. The nobles were cranky. The Duke of Buttershire had snapped at a muffin. The Chancellor had declared war on a curtain. Even the Queen had mistaken her wig for a hedgehog and demanded it be knighted. Mildred, ever observant, realized the problem wasn't politics, it was fatigue. So, she proposed a radical idea, the royal nap mandate, a daily, scheduled nap for all members of court, complete with cushions, lullabies, and optional biscuit service. The idea was met with confusion, yawns, and one noble who burst into tears of joy. To test her theory, Mildred hosted a pilot program called Siesta for Sanity. She converted the East Wing into a nap chamber, complete with velvet hammocks, portraits of sheep in ascending numerical order, a harpist who only played lullabies in D minor. The results were immediate. The Earl of Tiddlewink, previously known for shouting at furniture, began composing poetry. The Countess of Crinkleton stopped accusing muffins of espionage. Even the Queen's parrot began whispering instead of squawking. King Barnaby, who had once declared naps a distraction from jam, became the program's biggest fan. He began holding council meetings in bed, wearing a crown-shaped sleep mask, and referring to himself as His Drowsy Majesty. Mildred formalized the policy with a scroll titled The Snooze Accord, which included mandatory naps between 2 and 3 p.m., a ban on loud embroidery during nap hours, muffin distribution upon waking. The nobles voted unanimously in favor, though half were asleep during the vote. The royal nap became a cornerstone of Snorlandian governance. Treaties were signed in pajamas. Debates were held in whisper tones. The national anthem was rewritten to include the phrase, "Softly now, we slumber." And Mildred? She became the High Minister of Restful Affairs, with her own embroidered blanket and a scepter shaped like a pillow. Thus, In a kingdom once ruled by chaos and curtain taxes, peace was restored, not by force, but by 40 winks. The royal calendar had listed the event as mildly decorative banquet with optional wig parade, but somewhere between the soup course and the ceremonial jam toast, the queen stood up, pointed at the chandelier, and declared, "Let there be tango." No one knew why. Possibly because Sir Squawkington the parrot had just squawked, "Dance or perish." Or perhaps because the queen had mistaken the chandelier for a dance instructor. Either way, the throne room was cleared, the musicians summoned, and the nobles reluctantly removed their biscuit trays from their laps. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, ever composed, adjusted her spoon brooch and prepared to observe. She had never tangoed. She preferred diplomacy by muffin. But when King Barnaby, the easily distracted, extended a gloved hand and whispered, "Let's twirl for the realm," she sighed and accepted. The tango began. It was slow. It was dramatic. It was mildly offbeat. The king attempted a flourish and knocked over a vase. Mildred countered with a graceful pivot that accidentally launched her slipper into the Earl of Tiddlewink's soup. The nobles gasped. The parrot applauded. The queen wept into a napkin. Then came the incident. During a particularly ambitious spin, the king tripped over a decorative cushion and fell directly onto the throne. Not into it, onto it. The impact caused the royal scepter to fly across the room, land in a bowl of custard, and be declared missing for the next 3 weeks. The throne, offended by the undignified treatment, cracked slightly and began listing to the left. The royal architect was summoned. He arrived wearing a tutu. It was wig parade night, and declared, "This throne has suffered a tango trauma." The nobles panicked. The Duke of Buttershire proposed a new throne made entirely of muffins. The Countess of Crinkleton demanded a throne made of reinforced velvet and passive-aggressive embroidery. The Queen suggested using her footstool, Sir Reginald, who promptly fainted. Mildred, ever the voice of reason, stood up and said, "Perhaps the throne is not where one sits, but where one stands." With dignity, slippers, and a well-timed sigh, the room fell silent. The parrot whispered, "Profound." The king nodded and declared, "Let Mildred design the new throne." And so, the throne room tango incident ended not with scandal, but with a new royal initiative. Throne redesigned by Mildred, featuring cushioned armrests, built-in muffin compartments, a discreet drawer for emergency naps. The nobles applauded. The queen danced with a curtain. And Mildred? She retrieved her slipper, adjusted her wig, and added royal furniture consultant to her growing list of titles. It was a foggy morning in Snorlandia, the kind of day when nobles wore extra lace to feel important, and the queen mistook her breakfast for a diplomatic envoy. The palace was quiet, save for the distant sound of Sir Squawkington the parrot reciting muffin recipes in Latin. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore was enjoying a peaceful stroll through the East Wing, mentally drafting a proposal for nap-based taxation, when she heard a gasp followed by a dramatic declaration, "My love, you've returned." She turned to see the Duke of Buttershire, arms outstretched, passionately embracing a curtain, not just any curtain, a particularly regal one, embroidered with tiny crowns and smelling faintly of lavender and old decisions. The Duke, known for his emotional instability and fondness for jam-based metaphors, had apparently mistaken the drapery for Lady Crinkleton, his former flame and current nemesis. The nobles gathered quickly, some out of concern, others out of curiosity, and one because he thought it was a new form of interpretive dance. The Queen clapped politely. The curtain remained silent, dignified, and slightly wrinkled. Mildred, ever diplomatic, approached the Duke. "Your Grace," she said gently, "that is a window treatment, not a woman." The Duke blinked, but she listened so patiently, and her folds so mysterious. The Countess of Crinkleton arrived moments later, wearing a gown that looked suspiciously like upholstery. She was not amused. "I demand satisfaction," she declared. "He's emotionally entangled with a textile." A duel was proposed. Not with swords, of course. Snorlandia preferred passive-aggressive embroidery contests. The Duke stitched a heartfelt apology in cursive. The Countess responded with a tapestry titled, "Men are curtains with egos." Meanwhile, Mildred saw an opportunity. She proposed a new royal initiative, the Drapery Decorum Act, which included mandatory curtain labeling to prevent romantic confusion, emotional support footstools for nobles prone to attachment, a ban on curtain-themed poetry during council meetings. The act passed unanimously. The Duke was assigned a personal valet to help distinguish furniture from people. The curtain was knighted for its patience, and the Queen, inspired by the drama, began referring to her wig as Sir Fluffington. Mildred, as always, remained composed. She added, "Textile relations," advisor to her growing list of titles, and quietly drafted a scroll titled, "How to Avoid Falling in Love with Furniture." In the royal palace of Snorlandia, cartography was considered a noble art, usually involving scrolls, compasses, and at least one dramatic cape flourish. But Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had no patience for parchment. She preferred muffins. One evening, while nibbling on a particularly crumbly cinnamon creation, Mildred noticed something curious. The crumbs had fallen in a pattern that resembled the palace layout. The east wing looked suspiciously like a scone. The council chamber resembled a squashed biscuit, and the Queen's private garden, a perfect cluster of poppy seeds. Inspired, Mildred began experimenting. She created a crumb-based map of the palace, marking key zones of influence: Jam Alley, where treaties were signed and occasionally eaten; Curtain Corridor, site of emotional entanglements and textile confusion; the Muffin Vault, guarded by a goose named Gerald and 3 sleepy guards; the Throne Room, now slightly tilted and filled with cushions. Each crumb represented a noble, a policy, or a potential scandal. Raisins were used for unpredictable personalities. Chocolate chips marked areas of strategic opportunity. Walnuts denoted places where the Queen had once tried to plant a crown. Mildred kept the map hidden beneath a silver tray in the royal tea room. She updated it daily, using crumbs from her morning muffin and occasionally a dab of jam for emphasis. It was her secret weapon, a delicious diagram of palace politics. One afternoon, Sir Squawkington the parrot discovered the map and squawked, "The biscuit knows all," before flying into a tapestry. The Queen, intrigued, declared the crumbs a divine revelation and ordered a formal investigation. The royal cartographer arrived, monocle trembling, and examined the tray. "This is revolutionary," he whispered, "and slightly sticky." Mildred, ever modest, claimed it was an accident. "I merely dropped my breakfast," she said, sipping tea. The crumbs did the rest. The nobles were baffled. The Countess of Crinkleton accused the map of espionage. The Duke of Buttershire tried to eat it. The Chancellor proposed a new department, the Ministry of Muffin Geography. And so, the crumb map became legend. Nobles began creating their own edible diagrams. One ambassador presented a treaty baked into a croissant. The Queen commissioned a mural made entirely of jam. And Mildred? She quietly expanded her map to include influence zones, biscuit alliances, and a secret tunnel beneath the nap chamber. Thus, in a kingdom ruled by size, slippers, and spoon symbolism, Lady Mildred continued to guide the realm, one crumb at a time. It began with a biscuit, not a metaphorical one, a literal, slightly overbaked oat biscuit served during the royal afternoon tea. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had suggested a new biscuit recipe to the palace chef, one that was softer, more diplomatic, and less likely to chip a molar. But the Royal Biscuit Guild, a crusty coalition of nobles devoted to tradition and tooth resistance, was outraged. "This biscuit lacks backbone," declared the Duke of Buttershire, snapping one in half and accidentally launching it into a tapestry. "It's a threat to our heritage." The Countess of Crinkleton, wearing a hat shaped like a teacup, added, "If we allow soft biscuits, what's next? Emotional vulnerability?" Within hours, the palace was divided. Team Crunch demanded a return to rigid, jaw-challenging biscuits. Team Crumble, led quietly by Mildred, advocated for softness, diplomacy, and jam-friendly textures. The rebellion escalated when the Biscuit Guild staged a protest in the throne room, stacking biscuits into barricades and chanting, "No crumbs, no compromise." The Queen, confused as ever, mistook the protest for a bake sale and tried to pay with buttons. Mildred, ever strategic, responded with calm. She hosted a midnight muffin summit, inviting key nobles to sample her new line of peace pastries. The summit featured muffin diplomacy simulations, a biscuit tasting blindfold challenge, a dramatic reading of The Muffin Manifesto by Sir Squawkington the Parrot. The turning point came when the Earl of Tiddlewink bit into a soft biscuit and whispered, "It tastes like forgiveness." The room fell silent. The Duke of Buttershire wept into a napkin. The Countess fainted into a pile of scones. Mildred proposed a compromise, the Biscuit Accord of Snorlandia, which included a dual biscuit system, crunchy for ceremonial occasions, soft for emotional ones, muffin representation in the Royal Snack Council, a national holiday, Crumb Day, celebrating unity through pastry. The accord passed unanimously. The biscuit barricades were dismantled and repurposed into decorative coasters. The Queen declared, "Let there be jam," and knighted a particularly diplomatic shortbread. And Mildred, she added snack strategist to her growing list of titles and quietly drafted a new scroll. It was a time of unrest in Snorlandia. Not war, not famine, just chronic crankiness. The nobles were exhausted. The Duke of Buttershire had begun arguing with doorknobs. The Countess of Crinkleton was seen weeping into a decorative cushion. Even the Queen had started calling her footstool Mother. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, now widely regarded as the kingdom's unofficial Minister of Muffins, Slippers, and Sanity, knew what had to be done. She summoned the Royal Council for an emergency midnight session, pajamas mandatory. The nobles arrived in various states of dishevelment. The Chancellor wore a nightcap shaped like a goose. The Earl of Tiddlewink brought his emotional support blanket. The Queen arrived riding a mattress and declared, "Let the snoozing commence." Mildred stood, spoon brooch gleaming, and presented a scroll titled The Royal Bedtime Treaty, a declaration of drowsy dignity. Its clauses included mandatory bedtime for all nobles at precisely 9:47 p.m., with a grace period for dramatic sighing, state-funded lullabies, performed nightly by harpists trained in passive-aggressive melodies, the Nap Chamber Expansion Act, converting the East Wing into a labyrinth of hammocks, fainting couches, and whispering fountains, the Muffin Before Midnight Clause, ensuring every citizen received a warm pastry before sleep. The nobles blinked slowly. The parrot squawked, "Ratify and recline." The queen clapped and fell asleep mid-applause. But not everyone was convinced. The Countess of Crinkleton, wearing a robe made of unresolved grudges, objected. "This treaty is too cozy. Where is the grit? The tension? The insomnia?" Mildred responded with a yawn so elegant it was later painted into a mural. "Your Grace," she said, "a well-rested kingdom is a wise kingdom, and wisdom begins with a pillow." The vote passed unanimously, except for the Countess, who abstained by snoring. The treaty was signed using quills dipped in chamomile tea. The parchment was pressed between two warm muffins for authenticity, and the Queen, upon waking, declared it the most important nap-related legislation in history. From that day forward, Snorlandia became the world's first sleepocracy. Decisions were made after naps, arguments were settled with bedtime snacks, and Lady Mildred, she added, architect of the drowsy accord, to her growing list of titles, and began drafting her next initiative. In Snorlandia, power was rarely seized with swords. It was claimed with sighs, snacks, and occasionally a well-timed flutter of lace. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had long carried a fan, not for fashion, but for strategy. It was embroidered with tiny spoons, reinforced with biscuit crumbs, and capable of sending subtle signals across a crowded ballroom. One flick meant proceed with caution. 2 flicks meant deploy muffins. A slow wave meant the Queen is talking to her footstool again. One evening, during the annual Ball of Mildly Important Nobles, Mildred stood at the edge of the throne room, sipping tea and observing chaos. The Duke of Buttershire was attempting to waltz with a tapestry. The Countess of Crinkleton was arguing with a chandelier. The Queen had declared herself Empress of Naptime and was wearing a blanket as a cape. It was time. Mildred flicked her fan once. The harpist switched to a lullaby in D minor. She flicked it twice. Muffins were discreetly distributed. Then came the wink, subtle, elegant, and aimed directly at the Chancellor, who had been teetering on the edge of rationality since the Biscuit Rebellion. The Chancellor blinked, nodded, and stood. "I propose," he said, "that Lady Mildred be granted full authority over matters of comfort, diplomacy, and snack allocation." The nobles gasped. The parrot squawked, "Long live the spoon!" The Queen clapped and fell asleep, mid-motion. The Countess of Crinkleton objected. "This is madness. She's just a mistress with a muffin agenda." Mildred smiled, adjusted her slippers, and replied, "Madness is jousting indoors. This is governance. With jam." The vote passed. Mildred was granted executive nap powers, snack veto rights, and fan-based influence privileges. The coup was complete, not with rebellion, but with refreshments. From that day forward, Mildred ruled quietly, but firmly. She issued decrees from a velvet chaise, held council meetings in pajamas, and once settled a border dispute with a tray of lemon scones. And the fan, it became a symbol of her reign, fluttering gently in the breeze, whispering power with every flick. Hallway 7 was not on any official map of Snorlandia Palace. It was tucked between the Royal Nap Chamber and the Ministry of Muffin Geography, and most nobles avoided it because it smelled faintly of lavender and unresolved tension. But Lady Mildred Pompington Snore knew better. Hallway 7 was lined with portraits, dozens of them, each depicting a former noble, advisor, or mildly influential biscuit enthusiast. The paintings were grand, dusty, and unnervingly lifelike, and they whispered, not loudly, not constantly, just enough to make you question your sanity while adjusting your wig. Mildred first discovered the whispers during a late-night stroll, when she heard a voice say, "The Duke of Buttershire hides jam in his boots." She paused, blinked, and turned to face a portrait of Lady Wafflington, who looked smug and slightly over-buttered. Intrigued, Mildred began visiting Hallway 7 regularly. She brought tea, slippers, and occasionally a muffin to bribe the more stubborn portraits. Over time, she learned their secrets. Sir Crumbleton's painting snored during budget meetings. Lady Tiddlewink's portrait claimed to know the location of the Queen's missing crown. Under the parrot's cushion, one painting simply repeated the phrase, "Curtains are watching," and refused to elaborate. Mildred kept notes, on napkins, of course, and used the whispers to guide her influence. She avoided alliances with nobles whose portraits muttered, "untrustworthy." She promoted policies that earned approving hums from the frame of Lord Biscotti. She once solved a diplomatic crisis by quoting a portrait that said, "Peace is just jam with patience." But the portraits weren't just gossipers. They were guardians of palace memory. They remembered every scandal, every sigh, every muffin-related coup. And they adored Mildred. "She listens," whispered Lady Wafflington's frame. "She sighs with purpose." "She once complimented my brushwork," murmured Sir Crumbleton's canvas. "She brought me a scone," said a painting of a goose, for reasons no one understood. Eventually, Mildred installed a velvet bench in Hallway 7 and declared it the Gallery of Gentle Guidance. Nobles were encouraged to sit, sip tea, and reflect on the wisdom of the whispering ancestors. The Queen visited once, mistook a portrait for her cousin, and invited it to brunch. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Snorlandia. The Queen was attempting to butter her crown. The Duke of Buttershire was arguing with a spoon, and Lady Mildred Pompington Snore was sipping tea while reviewing her muffin diplomacy notes. Then came the scream. "The throne is gone," shrieked the royal footman, bursting into the council chamber with a face so pale it matched the wallpaper. "It's vanished, evaporated, possibly eloped." The nobles gasped. The Queen blinked. The parrot squawked, "Check the curtains," and flew into a chandelier. The throne, Snorlandia's most sacred seat, upholstered in velvet and passive-aggressive embroidery, was indeed missing. All that remained was a faint outline of crumbs and one confused cushion. Panic spread like jam on warm toast. The Countess of Crinkleton accused the Duke of Buttershire of throne theft by distraction. The Duke claimed he'd been busy alphabetizing his jam jars. The Chancellor suggested the throne had simply gone on holiday. The Queen proposed replacing it with a large muffin. Lady Mildred, ever composed, examined the scene. She noted a trail of biscuit crumbs leading toward Hallway 7, a faint scent of lavender and rebellion, a note tucked under the cushion that read, "Sometimes power must stretch its legs." She followed the trail through the palace, past the whispering portraits, through the nap chamber, and into the royal linen closet, where she found the throne, reclining. It had been moved by the royal upholsterer, who claimed it needed emotional repadding. The throne, apparently, had been feeling underappreciated and slightly lopsided. Mildred sat beside it and whispered, "You are more than a seat. You are a symbol. But even symbols need cushions." She returned the throne to its rightful place, added a muffin compartment beneath the armrest, and declared a new holiday, Throne Appreciation Day, featuring velvet-themed parades, dramatic readings of throne-related poetry, a ceremonial nap in honor of royal furniture. The nobles rejoiced. The queen hugged the throne. The parrot squawked, "Long live the upholstery," and attempted to knight a footstool. The queen, mid-snack and mid-sentence, accidentally sneezed into her crown and declared, "Let Mildred be crowned." No one was entirely sure what she meant. Was it symbolic? Was it a sneeze-induced prophecy? Or had she mistaken Mildred for a decorative vase again? Regardless, the royal council took it seriously. Within hours, invitations were sent, muffins were baked, and the palace was draped in banners reading, "Long live Mildred," probably. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, ever composed, tried to clarify. "I'm not being crowned," she said. "I'm being complimented, possibly by accident." But the nobles were already preparing. The Duke of Buttershire commissioned a velvet throne shaped like a spoon. The Countess of Crinkleton began designing a coronation robe with passive-aggressive embroidery that read, "This is highly irregular." The Queen ordered a crown made of napkins and jam. The ceremony was scheduled for Tuesday, which in Snorlandia was traditionally reserved naps and mild declarations. The palace was packed. Sir Squawkington, the parrot, served as master of ceremonies, squawking, "All hail the spoon mistress." Between dramatic pauses, Mildred arrived, wearing her signature slippers, a gown made of diplomatic lace, and a fan embroidered with the words, "Let's not overdo it." The coronation began. The Chancellor read a scroll titled, "Reasons Mildred Might Be Queen." It included her ability to sigh strategically, her muffin diplomacy record, her uncanny talent for calming nobles with eyebrow raises. The Queen attempted to place the crown on Mildred S. head, but dropped it into a bowl of custard. The parrot retrieved it and placed it on Mildred's wig, upside down. The nobles cheered. The Countess fainted. The Duke wept into a biscuit. Mildred stood, adjusted the crown, and said, "Let this be a coronation, not of power, but of peace and pastries." The crowd erupted in polite applause. The Queen declared it the most confusing ceremony since the Great Curtain Wedding. And Mildred? She added, "Possibly crowned person," to her growing list of titles, and quietly drafted a scroll titled, "How to Accept a Throne You Didn't Already Ask For." It began with a yawn. Not just any yawn. A yawn so majestic, so prolonged, so emotionally resonant, that it echoed through the velvet halls of Snorlandia like a lullaby sung by a sleepy goose. Lady Mildred Pompington Snore had proposed a new initiative, the Grand Nap Experiment, a week-long rest period for all nobles, advisors, and decorative footstools. The goal? To test whether uninterrupted sleep could improve diplomacy, reduce biscuit-related aggression, and finally settle the debate over jam tariffs. The Queen, who had recently declared her wig too loud, approved the plan with a sleepy nod and a decree written entirely in crayon. Preparations began immediately. The royal nap chamber, was expanded to include hammocks, cloud-shaped cushions, and a harpist who played lullabies on loop. Muffins were distributed hourly. All meetings were postponed, except for one emergency session to determine the optimal blanket thickness. The answer, emotionally supportive. At precisely 9:47 p.m. on Monday, the grand nap began. The palace fell silent. Nobles curled into velvet nests. The Duke of Buttershire wore a sleep mask shaped like a treaty. The Countess of Crinkleton reluctantly participated, muttering, "This is undignified," before snoring into a pillow embroidered with passive-aggressive compliments. Lady Mildred oversaw the nap with gentle authority. She tiptoed through the halls, adjusting blankets, distributing warm tea, and occasionally whispering affirmations like, "You are powerful," even in pajamas. By Wednesday, the effects were undeniable. The Chancellor stopped arguing with doorknobs. The Queen began referring to her crown as a cozy hat of wisdom. Sir Squawkington, the parrot, started reciting bedtime poetry instead of tax codes. By Friday, Snorlandia was transformed. Treaties were signed with hugs. Muffin diplomacy reached an all-time high. The national anthem was rewritten to include the phrase, "Softly we slumber, proudly we snore." On Sunday, the nobles awoke, refreshed, enlightened, and slightly confused. The Queen declared, "I had a dream about jam and justice," and knighted a blanket named Gerald. Lady Mildred stood before the council, spoon brooch gleaming, and said, "Let this week remind us, rest is not weakness. It is wisdom wrapped in a duvet." The nobles applauded. The parrot wept. The Countess of Crinkleton admitted she'd never felt more emotionally moisturized. Years passed in Snorlandia, softly and sweetly, like jam spread on warm toast. The kingdom, once ruled by chaos, curtain confusion, and biscuit rebellions, had become a haven of naps, muffins, and mildly enthusiastic governance. And at the heart of it all was Lady Mildred Pompington Snore, the royal mistress who never wore a crown, never raised her voice, and never once abandoned her slippers. Her titles had grown absurdly long: Mistress of Muffins, Minister of Nap Affairs, Spoon Brooch, Strategist Throne, Whisperer, possibly crowned person, Architect of National Napping, Curator of Whispering Wisdom, Snack Strategist Emeritus. But Mildred never cared for titles. She cared for peace, for comfort, for the quiet power of a sigh well-placed and a biscuit well-timed. The nobles adored her. The Queen consulted her wig less often. The parrot composed a lullaby in her honor. Even the Countess of Crinkleton, now retired and living in a cottage shaped like a cushion, admitted she ruled with slippers, and somehow it worked. Mildred's final act as unofficial ruler was to establish the Royal Archive of Cozy Governance, a library filled with scrolls, crumbs, and velvet-bound wisdom. Her most famous scroll read, "True power is knowing when to nap and whom to share your muffins with." She retired quietly, slipping away from court life like a whisper in a warm teacup. Her slippers were placed in a glass case. Her fan was hung beside the throne. Her spoon brooch was declared a national treasure. And Snorlandia? It thrived. Treaties were signed over tea. Debates were held in pajamas. The throne never went missing again, though the Queen did once misplace her footstool in a hedge maze. Lady Mildred's name became legend, not shouted, but softly spoken, like a bedtime story passed from one sleepy noble to the next. And so, dear listener, The tale of Lady Mildred Pompington Snore comes to a gentle close, a story of slippers, sighs, and spoon-shaped influence. May your dreams be cozy, your biscuits be warm, and your throne always cushioned. Good night from the kingdom of Snorlandia. Sleep well.